Hi everyone and welcome to Gloomwood's Carnage. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Before we jump in, I just want to say a huge thank you for all your messages. During the most stressful moments, it's your support that really keeps this channel going. Now that we're back in this video, we're heading deep into our favorite mountains to explore 3 disturbing stories that happened inside remote cabins. We all know isolation can play tricks on your mind. But when the things you're experiencing are real and you know it's not just your imagination, that's when it becomes truly terrifying. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. At the end of last year, a man went through something he had never experienced before. He'd always been the kind of person who thrived on movement and energy. He loved what he did for a living, and burnout was never something he thought could happen to him. Even working long days and sleepless nights, he loved every minute of it. So when he finally hit a wall and felt real exhaustion, it took him a long time to even understand what was happening. He spent weeks in this state of apathy, unable to care about the things that once gave him purpose, and that terrified him. He didn't want to lose everything he had built over the years, so he did what anyone would do. He turned to the internet for answers. What he found was a mix of everything. Miracle cures, strange rituals, quick fixes that made no sense. But one theme seemed to repeat across all of it, the idea that nature could actually heal you. So he searched and searched until he thought he'd found the perfect solution, a week in a cabin tucked away in the Smoky Mountains. The original plan was for him to go with his girlfriend, but 2 days before they were supposed to leave, she got a response from a job she'd applied for, and she couldn't make it. They tried to reschedule, but since it was late summer, there wasn't a single opening until deep winter, and neither of them had the experience to survive that kind of isolation in the snow. So in the end, he went by himself. He was nervous, more stressed than he'd admit, because he had no experience being alone in places like that. The thought of something going wrong kept gnawing at him. He told himself he'd probably scare himself half to death. See shadows where there were none. Let every creak of the woods send him into a panic, the perfect city guy who thinks he can handle the wilderness. On the drive up, he even laughed at the idea of how terrified he'd probably be at night, but he went anyway, determined to get better, determined to push through. When he got to the cabin, he was pleasantly surprised. It was cozy, well kept, and it seemed to have a decent security setup. For the first time, he thought maybe this wouldn't be the nightmare he had been bracing for. The first 3 days were incredible. He hiked trails, wandered near the cabin, and to his surprise, he fell in love with the silence, with the isolation, and he found in himself a courage he didn't think he had. It wasn't until the night of the 3rd day that he realized something was deeply wrong. He was in the bathroom brushing his teeth when he heard it. The faintest sound, almost impossible to catch, but he knew he had heard it. It was mechanical, a soft click and whir, the sound of a camera lens adjusting. He froze. That sound was too specific to be his imagination. He looked around, paranoia setting in, the weight of being watched pressing down on him. There was a small window in the bathroom, and at first he thought the sound had come from outside, but when he tried to look out, all he could see was the black wall of the forest. Still, he convinced himself there was someone out there. His chest tightened as he rushed through the cabin, slamming windows shut, double-checking the locks on every door and grabbing the gun he had brought with him. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, he'd held on to it for protection. Now it felt like the only thing separating him from whatever was out there. He told himself he'd done enough. The place was secure. Maybe he'd imagined the sound, but he couldn't shake the feeling. He sat down in front of the fireplace, lighting a fire just to calm his nerves because the sight of flames always brought him some kind of comfort. He was almost laughing at himself when he noticed it. The firelight hit the bookshelf at just the right angle, and in between the spines he saw a tiny glint, a pinpoint of light reflecting back. He blinked several times, convinced it was nothing. But no, it was there. He got closer and his stomach dropped. It wasn't a book, it was a hollow box disguised as one locked shut. And on the spine there was the smallest hole, easy to miss at a distance but obvious up close, a hidden camera. The sound he had heard hadn't come from outside, it had come from inside. Someone had been watching him. His body went cold. Rage flooding in just as quickly. He tore through the cabin and found them everywhere. Cameras in every room, the bathroom covered from multiple angles. The idea that someone had been watching him in the most private moments of his life made him sick to his core. He swore right then he would leave in the morning and go straight to the police. There was no chance he'd sleep in that cabin, not now, not after seeing those cameras. Even after pulling out the ones he found, he knew there had to be more. The thought of being watched made his skin crawl, so he grabbed the essentials, wallet, phone, gun, and went out to the car. He had parked out back, hidden from the road, and told himself it was safer to wait out the night in the car than stay inside that place. He tried to rest, but the forest pressed in, heavy and menacing. Every sound a threat, and his anger kept him wide awake. Around 400 a.m., he saw him. Headlights cutting through the trees, a big SUV pulling up the drive. The man's car was tucked out of sight, so he didn't think the driver noticed him. A figure stepped out, dressed head to toe in black, and without hesitation, unlocked the cabin door and walked inside. He didn't think. He was furious, running hot with adrenaline. He burst out of the car with his gun drawn, sprinted toward the cabin, and shoved the front door open. The figure was crouched near the fireplace, messing with something, probably another camera. When he looked up, his face went pale. The man aimed the gun, rage twisting his face, but he miscalculated. The figure was faster. He grabbed a fistful of ashes from the hearth and threw them straight into the man's eyes. Blinded, he stumbled, burning pain tearing through him. He heard the figure bolt, slamming out the door, tires spitting gravel as the SUV disappeared into the night. He crawled toward the bathroom, clawing at his face, desperate to wash the ash from his eyes. The pain was unbearable. He spent hours under the water, fighting the agony, waiting for dawn, just so he could drive far enough to call for help. He spent 4 days in the hospital, had to undergo surgery on one of his eyes, and the doctors told him it was sheer luck he didn't lose it. As for the figure, he was sure it had to be the owner of the cabin, but the police told him otherwise. The owner lived in California, hardly ever visited, and hired a company to clean between guests. They showed him photos of every employee, every person with access to the cabin, but the figure he saw that night wasn't among them. It's been a year since then, and he still doesn't have answers. This next story happened to an electrician in late October of 2017. At the time, he was 27, working long hours in Pittsburgh. His closest friends, a planner and a driver, had been part of his life since high school. Every year around Halloween, they'd take a short trip together. Nothing fancy, just a way to escape work and catch up. As they were growing up, they spent their lives together. But as they got older, they really had to make an effort to create moments to be together. Otherwise, each of them would end up living his own life, and inevitably, they would drift apart like so many friendships do. That year, the planner suggested a cabin his friend owned in West Virginia. No cell service, nothing but them, the woods, and a wood-burning stove. At first, it sounded perfect, especially in the context of Halloween. In fact, it felt like the perfect Halloween to the electrician. He'd always loved scary stories, always loved horror settings, but he hated the consumerism around Halloween. He hated the crowds in the streets and the frenzy it created. It felt completely removed from the origins of the tradition. Spending Halloween at the cabin, far from the doorbells ringing and the hysterical people, seemed perfect to him. The drive was about 4 hours, and by the time they wound through the last dirt road, daylight was already fading. The cabin was simple but cozy. One floor, 2 small bedrooms, and a big common area with a fireplace. The porch looked straight into the forest, so dense it felt like a wall. He remembered thinking how quiet it was, too quiet compared to what he was used to. The planner joked that if they screamed, nobody would ever hear them. They laughed at the time, but that thought clearly stuck with the electrician. That night, he had one of the most vivid dreams he'd ever had. He was in the middle of the forest being chased. Both of his friends were dead, and he was just running to save himself. No matter how much he screamed, nobody came to help him. He woke up drenched in sweat with the feeling that he had been caught and was about to die. He had to get out of bed and go to the bathroom to splash some water on his face. Then he checked that both of his friends were in their beds, sleeping peacefully, and decided to open the front door and sit on the porch, staring at the trees. The silence was truly oppressive, and he couldn't make out a single thing in the middle of the woods. Still, something made him stay out there for another hour. It was terrifying, but at the same time, it was equally beautiful. On the second night, they cooked, drank a few beers, and talked about life. It was one of those nights where the silence outside seemed peaceful, almost comforting. The electrician slept better than he had in weeks, but the third night was different. Around 11 p.m., after a long hike and another heavy meal, they were sitting by the fireplace when they heard movement outside. At first, it was subtle, like branches snapping under something's weight. They all went quiet. The planner smirked and said it was probably a deer or another animal. But when the sound came again, they exchanged glances. The driver grabbed a flashlight, and the three of them stepped out onto the porch. They were 3 guys and had some confidence in their physical abilities. If it was someone approaching, maybe the sight of the 3 of them together would discourage them. If it was an animal, then at least they'd know for sure and could head back to the cabin with peace of mind. The flashlight beam cut through the thick trees, and that's when they saw him. A man standing about 30 yards away, just beyond the edge of the light. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared, completely still. His clothes were dark, blending into the shadows, and the electrician couldn't tell if he was wearing a hood or a hat. The details were swallowed by the night. The planner's voice broke the silence as he called out, but there was no response. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he turned and began walking back into the woods. The planner made a move toward the trees, trying to see if the man had really disappeared, but the electrician and the driver grabbed him and told him the best thing to do was to go back inside. Once they were inside, they tried to laugh it off, telling themselves it must have been a hunter or a neighbor they didn't know about. They were clearly trying to reassure each other, joking and nudging to lighten the tension. But the truth was, the atmosphere had changed. They were 3 guys, sure, but there was a man walking through the forest, through the exact place where they thought they'd be completely alone. More than that, he had come close enough that they could see him clearly. And then, after a long moment of silence, he had simply walked away. The only thought running through the electrician's mind was that the man was either insane or had bad intentions and wanted to scare them. They stayed there talking for quite a while. They told themselves they were enjoying their time together, but in reality, they were just avoiding going to bed. Eventually, one by one, exhaustion caught up with them. The planner was the first to nod off. They even considered waking him and sending him to bed properly. But they kept talking until the driver fell asleep too, leaving the electrician alone, staring at the bed by the fireplace. He wasn't even sure if he actually fell asleep, or if he was just in that half-awake, half-asleep state when he heard a loud crash coming from the roof. His first thought was that a log or something heavy had fallen onto the cabin. The planner and the driver woke immediately, staring at the ceiling in disbelief. Then another crash came, followed by laughter. He had no idea how, but in that utterly bizarre moment, they realized the man had returned and he was on the roof doing God knows what. The planner grabbed the gun he had brought, and each of them snatched whatever they could, phones, keys, and the three of them bolted toward the car. As soon as the electrician climbed in, he saw the shadow of the man rise and stand upright on the cabin roof, staring in their direction. Then, with an agility he had never seen before, the figure jumped to the ground and sprinted toward the car. Luckily, the driver was at the wheel. If it had been the electrician, he was certain he would have panicked and hit him. The driver swerved the car around, heading back down the dirt trail toward the main road. They were still in shock when the planner asked if they had seen what the man was holding. The electrician had caught a glimpse of something, a stick with something at the end, but he couldn't make it out clearly. The planner said it was an axe. As soon as they had cell signal, they called the police and explained what had happened, then called the planner's friend. The police found a hole in that cabin's roof, though it didn't match the usual profile of someone trying to break in. If this guy really wanted to hurt someone, why not just smash a window? It would have been far easier. To this day, they have no idea what he wanted, only that it was nothing good. This final event happened to a man in September of 2019. 3 years earlier, he had inherited a cabin that sat right in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, only about 2 hours away from his home in the city. The cabin had been left to him when his uncle died. He was a hunter and the kind of man who carried a bad reputation everywhere he went. People described him as short-tempered, mean, sometimes even violent. The inheritor's own father, the man's brother, would often say he was a cruel man. Because of that, they barely spoke. The inheritor could only assume the reason the cabin fell to him was because there was no one else to leave it to. Hunting was something he always despised, so he had no intention of continuing whatever traditions his uncle kept alive in that place. For 2 years, he toyed with the idea of renovating it and renting it out. But each time he went up there to patch a roof leak or fix a rotting window frame, he found himself drawn in by the silence of the mountains. It was strange, unnatural even for him to feel that way. He had always lived in the city, convinced he thrived on its constant noise and pace. Yet, every trip to the cabin left him reluctant to return. The stillness, the distance from people felt like a blessing he didn't know he needed. That September, the pressure of the city became unbearable, deadlines stacked on top of each other, traffic grinding his nerves, the endless churn of people around him. He felt claustrophobic in a way he never had before. So he didn't hesitate. He packed a bag, drove out of town, and set his sights on spending a few days at the cabin. The drive from the nearest paved road took nearly 50 minutes down narrow dirt trails. Since he had left the house later than planned, by the time he arrived at the cabin, the sun was already sinking behind the ridgelines. The cabin was nothing fancy, just 1 floor, a loft above the kitchen, and a wraparound porch that looked down into a dense stretch of trees. The silence out there was so thick, he remembered thinking that it was exactly what he loved. But for the first time, that silence felt heavy, strange. He had never felt that before and told himself that the stress was finally starting to get to him. He needed to fall into the rhythm of the forest. The first night was uneventful. He made a fire in the stove, read a little, and fell asleep to the sound of wind pushing through the trees. It had always been a sound that gave him peace of mind. It wasn't until the second night that he started to notice that something had truly changed in the air. He had been sitting on the porch around dusk when he caught sight of something moving between the trees downhill from the cabin. At first, he thought it was just the light hitting a birch trunk, but the longer he watched, the more he realized it was shifting places. Each time he glanced away and back, it seemed closer. He felt a genuine chill rise inside him. He decided that whatever it was, he could observe it from inside the cabin. As he stepped in, he told himself it was just his eyes playing tricks on him. But when he locked the door and peeked through the window, he couldn't shake the unease. He didn't know how long he stood there staring into the trees, but it was long enough for the sky to turn completely black. So dark that the only thing he could see clearly in the glass was his own reflection. He was never the kind of person to trust instincts, let alone follow them. But for the first time in his life, he felt something raw and terrifying that he couldn't justify. It wasn't like he had ever had any problems at the cabin before or even seen anyone near it. He tried to dismiss it and decided to call it a night. Later that night, he woke up around 3:30 a.m. to the sound of footsteps outside. Something he had never heard there before. There was absolutely nothing for miles. What was someone doing out there, especially at that hour of the night? He stayed in bed for a while, partly because he was genuinely terrified that someone was out there in those mountains, so close to him, and he had no idea what their intentions were. He grabbed the knife he always kept on the nightstand for precaution and held on to it like it could offer him any kind of protection. He stayed there for what felt like forever, listening to the steps outside. There was no doubt that they were the steps of a person. Then he heard slow, deliberate steps on the porch. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't call out, just paced, boards creaking softly under their weight. The sound went on for what felt like forever before it stopped. He didn't know what was worse, knowing someone was outside circling the cabin where he could hear them, or knowing someone was still out there but silent, leaving him with no idea of what they were doing. He got up as quietly as he could and tried to peek through the cabin window. That's when he saw him. A man's body shape, dressed entirely in black, standing still and staring at the cabin. He looked like he was in some kind of trance. The inheritor couldn't make out his face, but he could see his eyes, wide and bulging. Then the figure locked eyes with him, and he swore he almost collapsed. It was the single most terrifying moment of his life. He pulled back instantly, hiding behind the curtain. But he knew that if the figure wanted to, he could smash that window easily. He heard him step closer to the glass, and he saw his shadow grow across it. He was clutching the knife against his chest, knowing it was the only thing he had if he came inside. The man stayed there just on the other side of the window, completely still until about 6:30 in the morning. Then, without warning, he simply turned and disappeared into the woods. The inheritor packed up everything he had and bolted for the car the moment daylight broke. To this day, he doesn't know what that man wanted or what he was doing there. He genuinely thinks the figure was under the influence of something, but he can't be sure. All he knows is that he won't be going back to that cabin anytime soon. It was a bizarre experience and one he never wants to repeat.